In 1968, two science fiction classics came out. Those, of course, were 2001: A Space Odyssey and Planet of the Apes. Both movies were considered milestones in the genre, which poses many questions, like who are we as a species, and what direction are we heading in? But today, we're not talking about those science fiction movies, but the other science fiction movie of 1968, Barbarella. The campy and raunchy, yet shameless space opera, which is definitely a part of the 1960s landscape, thanks to its psychedelic aesthetic, along with kitsch costumes and art design. Where we follow Barbarella, played by the beautiful Jane Fonda, who is a secret space agent, who must set out on an intergalactic quest to stop Duran Duran. Nope, not the 80s pop group, but an evil scientist who has invented a deadly laser weapon. Barbarella sets out into many strange and surreal alien settings in this often comical, schlock, sex-crazed caper, which features many iconic scenes, like the start of the movie where we see Barbarella get out of her spacesuit. And damn! So it's time to go back to the groovy days of the 60s and look into 10 things that you didn't know about Barbarella. So, let's do a deep dive into 1960s weirdness as we check it out. Number 10, based on a rather rude comic book. Yes, before the movie, Barbarella first graced her fans on the comic book page. She was the creation of French writer and illustrator Jean-Claude Forest, and she first appeared in the French magazine V in 1962, where in 1964 the character got her own comic book. The comics followed the sexy sci-fi adventures of Barbarella, a young woman who travels around the universe, often engaging in new worlds and meeting strange alien species. And yes, the comic would never shy away from sex, of which was a prominent part of the comic book adventures, and something that made it popular for its time. Although the comic wasn't without its criticisms, as it was often felt that the comic was a little too rude and raunchy. But that didn't stop the Barbarella comics from being translated to many countries all over the world. And during the 60s, the character was also seen as something of an icon of the sexual revolution. The Barbarella publication stopped in 1978, and sadly her creator, Jean-Claude Forest, passed away in 1998. But jump to 2017 and the comic would get relaunched with Dynamite Entertainment, which is still going on now. I think the best way to look at the Barbarella comics is not like your average DCs or Marvels, but more like the surreal heavy metal comic book magazine, which also started off as a French comic. The French, man, they make some pretty awesome and surreal comics. Number 9. Another film was made to start the production of Barbarella. So the Barbarella comics caught the eye of famed Italian producer Dino De Laurentiis, who had produced many movies prior, but more modern movie audiences may more be accustomed to the movies that came after Barbarella that he had produced, including the Arnold Schwarzenegger Conan movies, Halloween 2 and 3, The Evil Dead 2, Maximum Overdrive, and many, many more. He also produced fellow science fiction comic strip adaptation, Flash Gordon. But more on that later. De Laurentiis brought the rights to make a picture based on the Barbarella comic, but given that Barbarella was going to be a space opera, at a time when space operas weren't really the norm, he was going to have to generate funds. De Laurentiis managed to get backing from both a French movie company called Marianne Productions and Paramount Pictures to back up Barbarella. However, in order to get more funds for the Barbarella production, De Laurentiis decided to make another movie. Yeah, one on the cheap, so he can then use that box office earnings on Barbarella. And that other movie was the action crime thriller Danger Diabolik, which, like Barbarella, was also based on a comic book. And so yes, Danger Diabolik was made in order to make another movie. That movie, of course, being Barbarella. Number 8. Potential Barbarellas. When it came to casting the titular character of Barbarella, the intergalactic space agent, producer Dino De Laurentiis' original choice was Italian actress Sophia Loren. Well, that's according to etcanada.com, but she turned the part down. Fellow Italian actress Verna Lisi was also offered the part, but she also turned it down. Also offered to star as Barbarella was Raquel Welch and Brigitte Bardot, but once again they all turned the part down. It seemed that no one wanted to take on this role. Now this is where French filmmaker Roger Vadim comes into the picture, as he was hired as director, as he had a love of comic books and science fiction, and he wanted to, quote, depict a new futuristic morality, further adding that he wanted to make something beautiful out of eroticism. Now, his wife at that time was American actress Jane Fonda, so naturally she was next in line to play the part, but like everyone else, she was hesitant. After all, science fiction wasn't really mainstream during the 60s, with only a handful of science fiction movies actually being successful hits. But Vadim convinced her to take on the part, explaining that science fiction is, quote, a rapidly evolving genre. At that time, Fonda was already something of a sex symbol in America, thanks to, in part, an advertisement for a movie that she had starred in called Circle of Love, in which a picture of her in a state of undress was plastered across an 8-story building, namely 47th Broadway in New York, as a way to get everyone's attention and to promote the movie. Which, for its time, was considered really taboo and scandalous. Shh! Although, I'm pretty sure the movie's studio would have been in charge of that, so I don't know why that came back on her, but... Number 7. The writing was something of a fiasco. When it came to translating Barbarella from the comic book page to the big screen, writer Terry Southern was approached by director Roger Vadim and Jane Fonda to write the script. The funny thing is, Southern had just finished doing writing for the James Bond spoof Casino Royale, particularly for the lines for Peter Sellers, which in itself is its own story of an absolute cluster of a movie production. Southern got along really well with Vadim and Fonda, and enjoyed writing the script for Barbarella for its many interesting, outrageous and creative ideas. However, he supposedly wasn't getting along too well with producer Dino De Laurentiis, feeling that he wasn't too interested in making a good movie but a cheap one. Now, after Southern's efforts, several other writers would come on board to work on the script, one of them being Roger Vadim himself. All up, there are 8 writers credited to the script of Barbarella, some of whom were writers whom had previously written for Dino De Laurentiis' prior movies. However, there could have been even more writers, as writer Charlie B. Griffith, who previously wrote the script for the original Little Shop of Horrors, claims that he was also brought in to work on the script, and that he wrote about 1/4 of the final film, but probably didn't get credited due to the fact that he was the last writer to work on Barbarella. Something which I don't know is 100% true, but a claim that I found and am sharing nevertheless. Griffith also claimed that there was more like 14 writers whom had been working on the script for Barbarella since Southern's original script. And if that's the case, then it's a miracle that Barbarella wasn't a shockingly disjointed mess like the as-mentioned Casino Royale spoof. Number 6. Other casting quirks. Now, when it comes to the important character of the Black Queen, beautiful Italian-German actress Anita Pallenberg was cast in the part. She came into the production under a really strange circumstance, as she was friends with Barbarella's original scriptwriter, Terry Southern, who recommended her for the part. Now, he knew her because at the time she was going out with Rolling Stones band member Brian Jones, and at that time the Rolling Stones were trying to make a movie version of A Clockwork Orange, with the band members playing the Droogs. So Southern met Pallenberg while he was writing the script for this unmade Rolling Stones version of A Clockwork Orange. And so, essentially, she was cast as the Black Queen. And shortly after, her partner Brian Jones died from drowning in his pool, which according to the 2005 dramatisation Stoned, may or may not have been a murder, where she ended up hooking up with fellow Rolling Stones member Keith Richards, of which she may or may not have been having an affair with while she was still with Jones. Wow, I just went down a weird psychedelic rabbit hole. American actor John Philip Law came at the recommendation of Jane Fonda to play Pygar, Barbarella's winged angel-like love interest. Fonda and Law had previously starred in the movie Hurry Sundown, and in order to prepare himself for the part, Law read issues of the DC comic book superhero Hawkman, and of course the Barbarella comics. Law also really benefited from delays which took place in the early days of production of Barbarella, as during the delays, he would go on to play the lead character in the as-mentioned Danger Diabolik, as well as starring in the spaghetti western Death Rides a Horse. Wow, he was really busy. During the making of Barbarella, Fonda and her husband-director Roger Vadim had Law stay with them at their Italian villa, as well as Barbarella's creator, Jean-Claude Forest, who was working on the movie as a creative consultant. It is also said that a young Ian McKellen flew into Rome to do an audition for Barbarella, but he didn't get the role that he auditioned for. But while waiting for his audition to take place, Jane Fonda cooked breakfast for him. So, I guess that's something of a lose-win, right? Number 5. Filming. Barbarella was an Italian and French production, with filming taking place at Cinema City Studios in Rome. Filming took place immediately after the filming of Danger Diabolik, with Barbarella even using some of the same sets. There were a few scrapes that took place along the way during the filming though, like when the sinister Duran Duran put Barbarella into the excessive machine. Neither Jane Fonda or actor Milo O'Shea knew that the machine was going to catch fire and explode, because director Roger Vadim wanted their reactions of the explosion to be real. And of course, when it caught on fire, both the actors were absolutely terrified, with O'Shea believing that Fonda was actually being electrocuted. For the scene where Barbarella is being attacked by birds, the birds that were brought in to film that scene weren't exactly behaving as required in order to shoot that scene. So the solution for this was for director Vadim to get in a big fan and to just sort of blow the birds at Jane Fonda. Problem solved. And just who should turn up to visit the set when this crazy scene was being filmed? Well, none other than famed film critic Roger Ebert, who would go on to add that the fan caused the birds to poop, and thus the set was covered in bird doo-doo. And after several weeks of filming that scene, Fonda got ill with a fever and was even hospitalised, once again according to Ebert. So yeah, there does seem to be quite a few fairly interesting behind-the-scenes stories surrounding Barbarella. Sadly though, not all of them are great. Number 4. It wasn't a joyful shoot. Despite Barbarella being a fun, sexy romp, it seems that the movie's main star, Jane Fonda, sadly didn't have the best of time while making the movie. The most iconic scene in the movie is without a doubt the credits sequence, where Barbarella seems to be floating in zero gravity in her spaceship, where she slowly gets out of her spacesuit, revealing something of an intergalactic striptease. This scene was filmed by having Fonda lay on a sheet of plexiglass, with a picture of the set on display in the background, with a camera filming from above, in order to give the illusion that she is floating. Something I noticed while doing research for this video is a lot of articles claim that this scene celebrated Jane Fonda as a quote, sex kitten, which is a 1960s terminology. However, the behind the scenes were a lot more complicated than that. According to Wikipedia, Jane Fonda actually struggled on the set with Barbarella because she wasn't comfortable with her body and scantily clad costumes, further stating that at the time she had bulimia. Once again, going back to Wikipedia. Fonda's then husband and director Vadim further added that she didn't enjoy the shoot, and there are other claims that Fonda and Vadim were having their own problems with each other on the set. Supposedly, Vadim would have some alcoholic beverages during lunch breaks while filming, which would cause him to have slurred speech and affect his decision-making. Which is something that bothered Fonda, as she felt that when it came to filming, this made a lot of his decision-making ill-considered. And so, the marriage didn't last, and the two got divorced several years later in 1973. But regardless of her issues and woes, Fonda looks amazing as Barbarella and gives a joyful, spirited performance. Number 3. Music and titles. When it came to the music of Barbarella, experimental French music composer Michel Lemagne was hired to write the score. but his efforts were rejected. So instead, American composer Charles Fox and American songwriter Bob Crewe were commissioned to write the music for Barbarella. Fox would actually go on to create the theme song for the Love Boat TV series, and Crewe worked on creating several pop songs, including Walk Like a Man and Big Girls Don't Cry for the 4 seasons. Together they create a pretty swinging 1960s pop sound for Barbarella, as just like the rest of the movie, the music sounds very kitsch and of its time. It even has moments where it has use of a twangy guitar, where it almost sounds a bit like the James Bond music of that era. It's funny because I mentioned in my Good, the Bad and the Ugly episode that parts of that score also sound like Bond music thanks to the use of a twangy guitar. So maybe thanks to Bond, that was just the sound of action-adventure movies of that time. But to be fair, the Bond theme itself was an extension of the 1950s surfer music. A band called the Glitter House was brought in to provide some vocals to some of the songs and musical pieces used for the movie, of which the music and the songs would actually become a very important and remembered part of Barbarella. Speaking of Bond, the titles that were seen flying about in the movie's intro were created by Bulgarian cinematographer Arkady and Maurice Binder, who also created the title sequences for 14 James Bond movies, as well as creating the ever-famous James Bond gun barrel logo. Number 2, failed sequel. Now, ever since the release of Barbarella, there have been plans to bring the character back onto the big screen in either a reboot or a sequel, but it seems that another Barbarella movie just can't seem to get off the ground, despite several talents behind the scenes. First up, there were plans for a sequel to go into production in 1968, immediately after the theatrical release of Barbarella, which was to be called Barbarella Goes Down, and it was to see Barbarella go on an underwater adventure this time. But the movie didn't happen, and it's been put down to the theatrical failings of Barbarella. Then in 1990, Dino De Laurentiis was planning another sequel to Barbarella, a whole 22 years after the original. He wanted it to be made on the cheap, and to maybe star Jane Fonda's daughter in the role. But once again, this didn't end up happening. Then further jumped to 2005, to director Robert Rodriguez. And after directing the movie version of Sin City, which was also a comic book property, he then wanted to make his own version of Barbarella. Rose McGowan was cast as Barbarella, and modern James Bond scriptwriters Neil Purvis and Robert Wade were hired to write the script. And the movie was to be backed up by Universal Pictures. However, the production fell apart when Universal backed out due to an increasing budget. Rodriguez then found a studio in Germany who were interested in carrying on the production, but he then backed out as it would have meant that he would have had to spend long periods of time away from his family. Then Dino De Laurentiis and his wife Martha got back into the scene to try and yet again produce another Barbarella movie, but once again it didn't work, and Dino De Laurentiis subsequently passed away in 2010. Then in 2012, Amazon Studios were planning on making a TV series based on Barbarella, as well as a pilot episode, where Danish director Nicholas Winding Refn was brought in as director. But he eventually lost interest and left the production in order to direct the surreal horror movie The Neon Demon instead, in which he further stated, "You don't need to remake everything," and oh my god, no truer words have ever been said. Then in 2022, it was announced that there would be a new movie with an actress called Sydney Sweeney in the part, and the movie is to be made by Sony Pictures. But other than that, there doesn't seem to be any other news or reports, just that it's in the early days of production. Look, it's been a long road from 1968 to now. Sometimes I think the universe is trying to tell us to move on. Like, it's just not happening. Let it go. But who knows, maybe this film will be a great Barbarella movie. But yeah, look, part of me is like, oh yay, another remake. We haven't had one of those for 5 minutes. Number 1, Legacy Beyond Failure. Barbarella was released in Italy and France and the US in October 1968, and opened up in the number 2 spot behind The Jungle Book. Barbarella got a lot of backlash at the time, from vocal organisations condemning the movie's use of sex and nudity, with it even being labelled as sick and nasty. In fact, the movie didn't even get released in Australia till 1997, nearly 30 years after its original release. I mean, jeez, you would think the movie was Cannibal Holocaust, but it was really no worse than, say, a Carry On movie, which were outrageous British sex comedies of that time, which actually were accepted. The movie got other criticisms, particularly for its humour, or as the critics felt, lack of, and for the movie to just generally look too much like psychedelic plastic, with the movie also being referred to as junk. Yeah, for some reason, the critics really had a bee in their bonnets with this one. And despite opening up in the number 2 spot, Barbarella would only go on to make $5.5 million in the States, on a budget that was somewhere between $4 to $9 million. So for its time, the movie was considered a failure. In 1977, thanks to the newfound popularity of science fiction with Star Wars, Paramount re-released Barbarella, complete with a brand new poster, as well as a new title, with the movie now being called Barbarella, Queen of the Galaxy, with all the nudity removed, no doubt to make it more child-friendly. However, in later upcoming years, Barbarella would become a cult movie. In fact, I would call it the embodiment of a cult movie, where it's become a well-loved classic, where its 1960s schlock and sexual expressionisms are now widely praised. Barbarella has also become one of the most influential movies of all time, where it's left a massive impact on pop culture, with other science fiction movies and pop artists taking inspiration from Barbarella, such as the band Duran Duran, who got their name from the movie's villain. It's hailed as being both a product of its time, thanks to its 1960s psychedelic science fiction B-movie aesthetics, but also for being ahead of its time, for it being fearless with its sexuality and humour which was edgy for its time. To me, I kind of see Barbarella as being like a precursor to Dino De Laurentiis' future comic book science fiction movie, Flash Gordon, in 1980, as they are actually both very similar. They are both tongue-in-cheek, never take themselves too seriously, and are both incredibly schlock, but in a fantastic, enjoyable way. In fact, Flash Gordon is just as sex-crazed as Barbarella is. If you carefully watch that movie, there are tons of innuendo, and there is this whole who is sleeping with who, and this person likes this person, but this person likes that other person, and so on. So really, Flash Gordon 1980 is all about sex, just like Barbarella. Both movies are fun, madcap capers about exploring very colourful, weird alien worlds, with plenty of irresistible cheese and raunchiness thrown in for good measure. In fact, the movies could almost exist in the same universe, and would definitely work as a double bill. So if you haven't seen Barbarella, but are a fan of Flash Gordon 1980, then definitely check out Barbarella. All said and done, Barbarella is a fun, carefree movie. It has plenty of humour, enjoyability, and of course, sex appeal. And above all, it never takes itself too seriously. The Barbarella movie invites you to come down for a ride, and without looking too deeply into it, to just get sucked in by its carefree fun factor. Yes, it feels very much like a product of its time, but to me, that just adds to the experience of Barbarella. It looks and feels like an old comic book. And of course, Jane Fonda looks amazing. So if you're a science fiction fan, especially science fiction cinema, then definitely check it out. Anyway, I'm Minty, and let's all remember that at one stage during the shoot of Barbarella, the set would have been covered in bird crap, thanks to a big fan blowing a heap of birds at Jane Fonda. See ya!